the 6th FUSO Talks today. I already announced it. Embracing the future is what we want to talk about. How does the future look? Today we have three gentlemen that will cover three different areas that are important for the future. The first one is a British journalist who has written a book called Prisoners of Geography, and he will talk about geopolitics and geopolitical strategy and the impact on politics today. So please welcome on stage here with me, Tim Marshall. Coming to the next topic that we want to cover, which is economy and the economic outlook. We don't want to focus too much on GDP growth and the classical view on it. We want to look on the topic of automation and robotics and how will that change our working environment and the amount of people that we need. And Martin Ford is an author that has written a book on that, The Rise of the Robot, and I'm really excited to have him here today. Welcome on stage, Martin Ford. Thank you very much for coming. Please. You might not know the last gentleman by name, but you for sure have heard of the one word that he coined together with his partner and co-author of the book The Forced Turning and many other books, which I won't list down here. He has put together and developed a theory about generational change, and I'm really excited to talk to that about this today. Welcome on stage, Neil Howe. Thank you for coming. Looking forward. We want to talk about these three fields that I described, about geopolitics, economics, and society. And at the end, I would like to try to create that connection between these topics because I think they are really decisive for the world and how it will develop. And Tim Marshall, I would like to start with you. You've been a long time diplomatic editor of the Sky News in Britain, and I read that you've covered, and I mean, that's apparently the fact, covered 12 wars and crises in regions like Bosnia, Croatia, the Gulf War in Serbia, also political events like elections and so on. So with so much operational political experience, so to speak, I sense that your books have become or are more focusing on different aspects and of symbols in politics, like the book that we heard, your news, The Flags, or also the Power of Geography. Can I interpret this as the essence of your experience, and you're trying to now take all the experience that you have taken and analyze things more, or were you just fed up of traveling around and seeing all the misery in the world?
Both. Essence is a good word, context is another. I had 30 years on the road, running around, spreading misery everywhere. And at the end of it, I just thought, I've had enough of this, and I want to try and put all that experience, such as it is, into context. I was very surprised at the success of the book Prisoners of Geography. Forgive me, I'm not boasting, but it's sold 500,000 copies now in about 15 countries. So I asked myself why. And I think it is because it seeks to put context into the age of uncertainty. And I think that's what's happening. And the Flags book is the same. It's not really about flags. It's about identity, nationalism, symbolism, what presses our emotional buttons. Because I think we are in this age of uncertainty. It is a new age. We're struggling to come to terms with it and understand it. And hopefully, that my experience has enabled me to distill it into the essence.
Even today, in the age of missiles, of drones, and cyber warfare, geography has still that important aspects. Do you think this will be remaining a decisive factor, or do you think that these trends that I just mentioned will change that potentially?
It will change, but I freely accept that the prison bars of geography, because we are prisoners of geography, I argue, in that it influences and makes some of the decisions for you, but technology has always bent those bars. A cruise missile bends. those bars, but geography is still factored in. Yes, this person A couldn't reach person B, but with cruise missile they can. But that doesn't mean that the geography is no longer relevant, because then you're talking range. So geography is still front and center. One of the things that's going to happen, unfortunately, is that we will compete more in space at a military level, as well as hopefully at other levels. And the geography will also come in. At what point above here does Japanese airspace finish, and anybody can put anything they want above it? We don't yet have the laws. The law is behind the technology. So we bend the bars of this prison, but we still find ourselves trapped within geography.
Please welcome on stage Tim Marshall.
Thank you. First, thanks very much for the invitation. So my very small piece of this jigsaw is geography. I don't argue that it is the whole picture. I argue that it's the overlooked picture. It's the bit about history and politics and all the rest of it that people don't concentrate enough on. I think one of the reasons this is an age of uncertainty is because my generation grew up after the Second World War in the Cold War. It was very, very simple. It was a bipolar world. It was the Russians, the USSR, the Americans, and then the West. They would either all kill us and we'd all kill them, or we would both survive. It was a very simple world. And it was built on, certainly from our side of things, the Bretton Woods system. That's a broad brush for me. Bretton Woods grew the World Bank, it grew the IMF. I use it as a catch-all because also there was NATO, the United Nations, and along came the EU. All these structures, very, very solid structures. And we were perfectly happy with them, and they seemed to do pretty well for us. And then came the Unipolar World. After 1989, Berlin Wall comes down, you're left with the Americans, what the French called the hyperpuissance, the hyperpower. That was still pretty solid, but that was a brief period. Where we're now going into this age of uncertainty is actually the way the world usually is. We have had the best of it. Those of you who are 30, I'm sorry, but we had it better than you do. You've got longevity on your side. But at the moment, those structures that I talked about are shaking. And they're shaking because India, why would you accept that plucky little Britain should be on the Security Council at the UN and you're not? I can give you reasons why, but you probably wouldn't accept them. Along comes the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Along comes the Asian Investment Bank to challenge the World Bank. And the Americans said to us, the Brits and others, all their best friends, please don't join the Asian Investment Bank. And we all said, well, actually, and we all joined it. And that shows you that there's different powers no longer prepared to accept a unipolar or even a bipolar. It's a multipolar world. Layer onto that the crash of 2008-2009, when for many of us the money ran out, and layer onto that migration, immigration, and refugees, and we are in this real age of uncertainty. But what is certain is the map. The map doesn't lie. Next thing, again, follows Marc about everything being connected. About being in silos, about if you're a country manager and only concentrating on your country, you might get the politics right, but you'll be blindsided by something that's happening 1,000 miles away that you think, well, that's got nothing to do with me being the country manager here in Indonesia, but it might be. And that's why I think, and again, forgive me, Marc, for praising you, but I believe in that management structure of encouraging the team leaders to be able to see things both at the macro and the micro level, because everything is connected. And I will prove that of how Syria is connected to Russia, at what level. Let's start with Russia. It's the best example I've got that geography is a determining factor in history. Russia, 2/3 of its population lives that side of the Ural Mountains. That side of the Ural Mountains is flat. You see the North European plain there. The North European plain reaches all the way to the Urals, and it stretches all the way to France, and it's flat. Very good country for putting your cavalry or your tanks, or even your foot soldiers across. And people have done that. Swedes are Volvo. Is Scania Swedish? Yeah, Scania. Volvo, ABBA, IKEA, Bjorn Borg. Yeah, but they were also one of the most warlike nations in Europe. People have forgotten that about the Swedes. And they used to pop down across the Baltic, through the flat land, and invade Russia. So did the Poles. So did the Lithuanian Empire. Who knew? But there was one. The Brits occasionally came up here into flat land. And you know where this is going, my German friends. The French came in 1812. The Germans came in 1914, and despite their experience, did it again in 1941. Every single time, nearly everybody took the same route. See the Baltic Sea there? And the Carpathian Mountains there. That is only 300 miles wide. Here, I've got 1,000 miles of flat land to defend. Or, as everybody keeps coming through that gap in the North European plain, I could choose to move up there and defend Russia from there. And that geographic reality explains why Russia has always sought to push up as far west as possible. It must block that gap. It's done it ever since 17th, 16th century. They've got to plug that gap. Second thing why we will always know how Russia will act through geography is that it's very bloody cold up there. Very cold. Some of their ports freeze. You cannot be a great power, even now, in fact, perhaps especially now, without being a naval power 365 days a year. So bear in mind that flat land, and bear in mind the ports, and then bring yourself to the Ukrainian crisis in 2014, 2013. They have had this buffer zone between them and what they regard as an aggressive entity, NATO, the West, the EU. And they've buffered themselves all the way up, formally, to Berlin. Then they had to fall back to the Polish border and Ukraine. And then suddenly Ukraine flips into the Western sphere of influence. I don't gamble. If I did gamble, I would have put my mortgage on them annexing part of Ukraine. Which part? The Crimea, because that's where their only warm water port is. The geography gave Putin no choice. I'm not talking about morality, I'm talking about realpolitik and Hobbesian view of the world. They had to annex and get that port, because that's the only warm water port they've got. They also, if they've lost Ukraine, have to have part of a buffer because of the geography. So the Donbass region is where they fermented war, all down to here. They've tried to join it up to the Crimea, because look what happens here. You get to the border of Belarus, you still have your buffer. Going up to Lithuania, there's a corridor that connects you to the Baltic, the Kaliningrad-Konigsberg corridor. And Kaliningrad has Russian nuclear missiles on it. So you have got this geographic buffer. You've still maintained it. It's a lot narrower than it used to be. But you had to do that from the Russian perspective. Last bit on this map, that corridor connecting up to the Baltic, well, behind it are 3 NATO allies. And here is a coming test. If we give a green light to Mr. Putin that NATO is obsolete, to quote President Trump, or that Turkey is no longer reliable, which I don't think it is, what is to stop you going and thinking, I'll have Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which I regard as Russian anyway, if you're Mr. Putin? So, point being, you cannot just look at one thing in isolation. It is all connected to each other. And I just think that in business, you can do the same thing. And the best people in my industry, when I was a reporter, the best editors, were the ones who had been in the field. They knew how a camera worked. They knew, oh, we need a night vision lens. Oh, God, they're $8,000 each. Yeah, but we need a night vision lens because otherwise we're not going to be able to film. They had that knowledge and experience of that part of my industry, that part of my industry, that part of my industry. And so when they're making decisions up here, they know why things matters because they've done all the different things. They didn't live in their silos. You can apply exactly the same to international relations, and I hope you can apply exactly the same things to your industry. It's big, broad brush stuff. I'm convinced of it. I hope you are. Thank you very much.
Once again, thank you for joining us, Marc Ford.
Thank you.
Maybe just first as a background, you are an entrepreneur and started a company in the US. Can you briefly talk about what you do and what led you to become an expert in automation and artificial intelligence?
Well, I studied computer engineering, and then I started a small software company in Silicon Valley. This was back in the 1990s, and this was a software company that happened to focus on Microsoft Windows software. And I built that company to a small, viable size. But back in the 1990s, software was a tangible product. It was something that was on a CD-ROM and was put into a box and was sent to customers. And so there were quite a few jobs there, even within a software company, for typical people who didn't necessarily have a lot of education. So one of the things I saw in the course of running my business was how quickly that kind of work evaporated. So that's one of the things that really got me thinking about this issue of what would happen as more of the economy went digital and as robots and artificial intelligence increasingly took on more powerful roles, and how this what I was seeing in my own small business was eventually going to scale across the whole economy. And that's really what led me to get interested in this topic and to begin writing about it. And now I'm pretty much focused entirely on this, thinking about this issue and going around to events like this and talking about it as well.
Is there a positive wealth creation, something that will come from automation and artificial intelligence that will create more wealth and more social stability? Or do you think it's all about just reshifting the wealth or redistributing?
Well, without question, it can create wealth, and I hope that it will. I remain an optimist. The real problem we face is not a problem of wealth creation, it's a problem of the distribution of the income and the wealth. And it's definitely becoming more and more concentrated, and what's happening is that increasingly it's going to be those people who own lots of capital, or in effect those people that you might say own the robots, are going to capture more and more of the income, and the rest of us, the vast majority of people on this planet, really the only real asset they have is the value of their labor. That's what they own, and most people don't own anything beyond that, not in any meaningful fashion. And so as this process continues and that labor becomes in effect less valuable for a great many people, it's going to be a huge problem. And I think that solving that problem is certainly one of the biggest challenges we face going forward.
The stage is yours. Please welcome on stage Marc Collins. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you very much. It's really a privilege to be here. For nearly a decade now, I've really been focused on this question of the potential impact of technologies like robotics and artificial intelligence. And I have to say that I've really come around to the view that we might well be on the leading edge of a massive disruption. And I think it's a disruption that ultimately could end up putting just a terrific amount of stress both on society and on the economy. And that will be true certainly in developed countries like Japan or the US or Germany, but it will also be true in a very dramatic way across developing nations in Africa and Asia and so forth. And the central feature that I've really focused on is this idea that smart machines, algorithms, robots are increasingly going to substitute for human workers. They're going to take over more and more of the work that's now being done by people, and I think that ultimately that's going to lead to some real challenges for us. This really comes down to what you might call digital leverage, the fact that businesses are increasingly relying on this powerful information technology to produce ever more, but they're doing that in a less labor-intensive way. And I do think that as that accelerates, we're looking at some real disruption here. What exactly is different about today's information technology relative to the technologies that have been disruptive in the past. And I would point to three fundamental things. We're now at a point where things are going to move at really an extraordinary rate. Things are moving very, very rapidly in terms of absolute progress. And of course, things are also going to continue to accelerate from this point. So what that means is that as we look forward to the coming years, and especially to the coming decades, we're going to see things that very likely astonish us in terms of what technology proves to be capable of. The second really crucial point that I would make is that machines and smart algorithms are, in a limited sense, beginning to think. They're genuinely taking on cognitive capability. And by this, I don't mean science fiction, artificial intelligence, or robots that are running around acting like people. But what I mean instead is that smart algorithms are beginning to make decisions, they're solving problems, and most importantly, they're learning. The third really key factor is that information technology and increasingly artificial intelligence is really becoming a general purpose technology. What I mean by this is just that it's going to scale across everything, every employment sector, every industry. Nothing is going to get a pass on the impact of that technology. One comparison that's been made quite a few times, and I think it's pretty accurate, is to compare IT and also artificial intelligence to electricity. It's almost like a utility. It's something that is really going to scale across everything. The nature of the machines used in the workplace are changing. You know, if you look back at that so-called golden age after World War II, productivity machines were clearly tools. They were something that workers used that made those workers more valuable. But increasingly, technology is transitioning, and what's happening is that in many cases, the technology and the machines used in the workplace are not complementing workers and making workers more valuable. In many cases, they're beginning to substitute for workers or replace workers and actually making workers less valuable. Really, the potentially biggest disruption is going to come in the white-collar arena. And what you're seeing on this graph here is, it comes from an article that appeared not too long ago in the Wall Street Journal, and it's really focused on the automation of knowledge jobs or white-collar jobs. And what you see on the right is a bar chart showing the headcount or the number of employees in the corporate finance department in the largest US corporations. So corporate finance would be jobs like accounting, accounts payable and receivable, financial planning, and so forth. And if you look at this graph, you see that the number of employees in that department relative to the revenue of the corporation has actually declined by about 40% over a recent 10-year period. So that's, you know, almost half those jobs have disappeared. In order to have a viable market economy, really in order for capitalism to continue to work, you've got to have consumers. You've got to have people that have the income and the confidence to buy what's being produced. If you don't have that, then you run the risk of getting into a situation where there simply isn't enough consumer demand to drive the economy. How do we solve that problem? I think ultimately, in the long run, we'll have to find a way to decouple incomes from traditional forms of work. And I think the best, simplest way to do that is going to be some kind of a guaranteed minimum income or a universal basic income, and that's becoming a very important idea. So my purpose in really talking to you and to groups like you, and also in writing about this, is really to get you thinking about it, and I hope talking about it, and I hope that you will incorporate this into your thinking as you manage your businesses and as you engage with other people. From that process will emerge some solutions that will allow us to find a way to build a future that really works for everyone and allows everyone to benefit from the incredible innovations that I think we're going to see over the coming decades. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Marc. It's actually interesting that in economics, there always has been a theory about the cyclicity of economic development. I mean, it's a known fact for everybody that there are ups and downs, that there are crises and highs. It's never been that prominently discussed in history, or especially in social history, that there are these cycles, and there also, to my knowledge, hasn't been a theory that explains that based on generations and their impact.
But I will say, cycles of political realignment, cycles of drug abuse, cycles of cultural and family change, there have been a lot of them. I think my innovation, if there is any, is to say that underlying a lot of these cyclical changes that people have talked about is the generational experience, because it gives a periodicity to the cycle. There is a certain rhythm about being born, coming of age, getting old, and your active adulthood, which determines whether or not the cycle is, 2 years or 200 years. And that's sort of where I went with at least some of my generational work. When it comes to technology and Google and Amazon and Facebook, millennials truly believe that algorithms can remake our world for the better. Most boomers I talk to, they kind of go with their gut, they listen to their emotions, and they're usually terribly pessimistic about where this world is going. You look at millennials, and they're doing robo-advising, and they've got all their savings in some target date fund, and they're really happy with these new algorithms. And I think that's an interesting, perspective that this new generation is giving. I think particularly the fact that millennials are so much more enthusiastic about doing things in groups or teams. You see them, they're living with each other, they're living with their families. They have new workspaces where no one has offices, they places like WeWork, or they're really moving us back to the old bullpen office where everyone worked together in the same room, which we used to have in the 50s and early 60s, until boomers invented all of these cubicles, so we could all be private. Millennials are bringing back the idea of commonality in the workplace.
I think it would be best if you introduce your theory to us, and please, the stage is yours.
All right,
thank you, Neil Howe.
Thank you. I come to talk to you all about generations, a new group of people who come along at a certain time, and because they come along at a certain time, they're shaped differently. What is a social generation? And I'm going to define it as follows. A social generation is a birth year group whose length is the length of a phase of life, about 18 to 22 years, we kind of think of as a generation-long group of people, and which shares a common age location in history. So a generation feels a certain affinity to a certain era of history when they're children, and a subsequent era of history coming of age into adulthood. And secondly, a common attitude and behavior traits. And finally, a common collective identity. We talk about my generation, your generation. We kind of think about, we know who we're talking about. We give names to them, right? So you talk about baby boomers, Generation X. What the heck does that mean? So that kind of thing. Who are the generations alive today? And the first things I will say is, when looking at generations, is you look at, these are American generations, or US generations. These are conventional names we give them. These are birth dates. And of course, these are location and history. And that's really how we define generations. I mean, take a look at these different generations. This generation here, born roughly in the first quarter of the 20th century, the GI generation. Now, they're often called as the greatest generation in America. And great, why? Well, because they came of age with the New Deal, the Great Depression, World War II, great, institution builders, and that gave them their name. And you see the next generation, just too young to participate in the war, but remembering it as children, was the silent generation. They got their name in the early 1950s. And you just go on down. You can see the generation just too young to remember World War II are the boomers, and they came of age during that period, kind of ground zero for every boomer, that period of radical sort of social and family and cultural experimentation they call the consciousness revolution. Generation X with the children of that era. They came of age with the culture wars, primarily with Reagan for first wave Gen Xers, but that was a very different era. Millennials have no memory of the consciousness revolution, which kind of explains that era of sort of social and family experimentation, not even a childhood memory. So for millennials, Woodstock is a standard of learning educational history question, It'd be like asking a boomer about the New Deal. It's something that happened before we even came along. And of course, they're coming of age in a period when history is beginning to move even faster. Recently, due to the Great Depression and World War II, after all, were world events, do we see increasingly a commonality in generational traits around the world, which I'm going to point out here. So particularly in all of the English-speaking world, all of Europe, including Russia, and most of East Asia, we see common generational characteristics, at least among today's living generations. And I think that says something very interesting about all of their future, or the collective future of not, we're talking about not just the United States, but the rest of the world as well. What cycles of history are tied to generational change? And that really makes us look at this. I want to bring back this and simply ask, because in my schema, 4 apart generations and 4 apart eras tend to be alike. And I want to ask this question: what do these eras have alike? That is to say, what I'm saying is, the generation that came of age in the 30s, what does it have alike to millennials coming of age today? If anyone would ask me if there's any generation recently in history that resembles the generation we've just lived through, which would it be? I would say no question about it. It is the 1930s. And one of I think the parallels are so overwhelming that I don't even, both were played out in the shadow of a global financial crash. Well, that's obvious. Slow and disappointing economic growth, underemployment of labor and capital, tepid investment, deflation fears. We haven't seen that since the 1930s. Powerless central banks, growing inequality. The whole idea of a secular insufficiency of consumer demand, the thing we were just talking about, was the huge fear of the 1930s. But what about, even more powerfully, some of the geopolitical similarities? Rise of isolationism, nationalism, right-wing populism. Gee, when was the last time we saw that? Waning influence of great power alliances or agreements. Cultural and social, falling rates of fertility, falling rates of home ownership, more families living together, just like the 1930s. Spread of localism and community identification, rejection of established political parties and elites, decline in youth violence, blanding of the youth culture. I could go on and on. We see so many parallels here. Now, what does this mean? It means that in general we think, and there are exceptions, particularly if you look at other countries, that we see a certain rotation of archetypes. We see, for instance, hero generations like the GI generation tend to be raised right after an awakening. They're protectively raised. They came of age during a social emergency, and they're institutionally very powerful for the rest of their lives. They're greeted by an awakening fired by the young in old age. Boomers live that life cycle. Prophet archetype like boomers live that life cycle in reverse. They're born right after the crisis, indulgently raised, come of age of the awakening, and as they get older, as senior leaders, they invariably take the nation into and through the next outer world crisis. Similarly, there's a pattern almost like seasons of the year. You consider that almost spring, summer, fall, and winter of 20-year periods of history that correspond to these shifting generational alignments, right? Final question, what will follow the Fort-turning crisis era? Well, we all hope, and I think people have said it many times, everyone wants a new golden era. But history says something more interesting. Golden eras only follow crises, right? The original golden age of Augustus followed the horrible Roman civil wars. You look throughout history, golden ages follow crises. We need something occasionally which forces us to tear down and rebuild systems which become ossified and dysfunctional. Generational forces allow that to happen. We hope we get through this. I think when you look at history from a cyclical perspective, the answer isn't so much, gee, how are we going to get to this wonderful new place historically? But rather, can we all play our roles well to get to the other side with a minimum of damage, minimum of violence, to truly create this whole greater society with all the augmentation of artificial intelligence, everything else we're looking at, to give us a much better life, not only for millennials, but their kids, and at the very least, possibly their kids as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Neil. And that closes the cycle of these three great presentations and great topics. recent younger generations are spending more and more time on technologies like iPads, iPhones, computers, rather than spending time with family or with friends. Will this have a big impact on their emotional intelligence?
Don't ask how technology is shaping generations. Ask how generations are shaping technology. Ask, for instance, how it is that it was only when boomers came along that we started inventing iPhones and personal computers. You got an I, personal? The whole boomer idea of technology was to get away from those mainframes, get away from those A-frame organizations that only needed 5 computers, and distribute it to all the individuals. And everything about the way boomers thought of technology was that way. What was this big surprise for when millennials came along? It was that suddenly millennials were getting on their computers and they were chatting to each other. And then suddenly it was Facebook and the rise of social media.
What would the human brain still add as a value when artificial intelligence? So where's the reason for our existence after AI gets so powerful?
And that generally would fall into a few categories. The first would be creativity, building something genuinely new, thinking outside of the box. For now, that's something the machines aren't especially good at, although that could change. The second area would be forming deep relationships with people, and qualities like empathy, for example, those types of roles. And a third one would be, for those who aren't necessarily bound for university, things that really require lots of mobility and dexterity, things like skilled trades and so forth. Those are the areas that are safest. So I would sort of push your kids in those directions, but the most important message would be, the most important thing you can learn is how to keep learning, how to really embrace learning as a lifelong endeavor. I mean, that's going to be absolutely critical to everyone in the future.
What's your take on North Korea, and what do you think that this conflict will go violent? And maybe you can embed it in the whole topic of China not wanting to have a unified Korea, because then they would have the Americans in front of their door. So what's your take on that?
Which is worse, a nuclear-armed North Korea or war in Korea? Is there a third way? I'm not sure there is. Because the third way is compromise on both sides, and the compromise is that Kim Jong allows in UN weapons inspectors into his facilities. Now, if you are God, the Sun King, you can't do that. So I'm not sure that's the way ahead, which leaves us the two other solutions: a nuclear-armed Korea or war on the Korean Peninsula. War on the Korean Peninsula is thinkable. It's not unthinkable. After all, it's happened. The problem with it, as many of you will know, the DMZ is only 35 miles from Seoul. There's 10,000 artillery pieces dug into hard rock. If I press a button now, I fire 10,000 missiles at Seoul. 20 seconds later, I fire another 10,000 missiles. By the first 2 or 3 minutes, I've fired 30,000 missiles at Seoul before anybody's in the shelters. Now the US Air Force is up in the air, and they're beginning to take them out. It'll take 2 or 3 days. That's just that little bit, not the whole scenario. Death toll, 60,000 civilians. So it's thinkable, because I just thought of it. So how do you avoid that? Maybe you just take them out with the first strike. I don't think so. Okay, let's get used to living with a nuclear bomb, the North Korean nuclear bomb. At this point, the North Koreans will bully the South Koreans over a period of 5 to 10 years, 15 years, and eventually try to unify the Korean Peninsula under Pyongyang, which China would back. And the deal then is the Americans must go home. And that's the dominoes. Japan will tell the Americans to go, etc., etc. So I'm still left with these two problems, neither of which are acceptable. A nuclear-armed North Korea, war on the North Korean Peninsula. I don't know what will happen, but I do know that successive US presidents have not dealt with it. For all our problems with Mr. Trump, which are legion, he has put 3 American aircraft carriers into the Pacific. He has moved extra bombers to Guam. He has moved the F-35s extras to Japan. He's talking loudly and carrying a big stick. At the moment, it's not working. So we are at, it's 5 to midnight. Midnight is either war or a nuclear bomb. He has moved us a lot closer to either getting the North Koreans to back down through threat of violence, sparking the war, or he was bluffing all the time. So I can't tell you what's going to happen, other than we are closer to midnight now than we have ever been.
Thank you very much, gentlemen, for this exciting evening and all the very interesting presentation. Thank you very much. Have a good evening. Thanks.